Thank you so very much. This is an amazing vantage point in that I can see that the room is full, and I thank so many of you for coming out today on this Sunday to help us commemorate the 100th anniversary of my father's birth. Oliver Brown was an ordinary man who was simply called to engage in something extraordinary, unbeknownst to him, meaning everyone in this room could possibly answer that call tomorrow. Life shows up in very extraordinary ways, if you will. Well, 5 months ago, we lost my eldest sister, Linda, who graduated from Central High School in 1961. And fortunately for us, 4 years earlier, we were able to be here together with her and my mother and her daughter, Kim, to provide a presentation as part of the Springfield Public Library series on civil rights. So I'm so pleased that she was able to, once again, walk the hallowed halls of Central High School. But I did remind her that day of how, as a little sister, on one occasion, we lived across the street behind Benton Avenue, and I was sent on a mission by Mother on a very rainy day with a pair of rubber galoshes in hand. Now you can imagine how a teenage girl, seeing her little sister, approaching her with these galoshes, wasn't too happy to see me. But I was a girl appointed to do something my mother told me to do. Well, Brown v. Board of Education, as you've heard, was a monumental change for this nation. When I saw the article in the Springfield newspaper about my father's activism and the plans that Drury College has in mind to commemorate and to preserve that legacy, I was absolutely astonished and overwhelmed. And like a good 1950s daughter, you know what I did? I called my mother. And at 97 years old, Mother too was thrilled, amazed, and very pleased that they were remembering Dad in this way. So I am grateful for the opportunity to be here today to represent my family. But not only my family, but all of the men, women, and children who were part of Brown versus the Board of Education. Being in Springfield again is a pilgrimage. My father did not set out to make history or to shift the political tide that resulted. We were a family for whom history came calling. See, my parents, because I want you to know the ordinary nature of who we are, who we were. My parents were not activists in the 1950s. They were merely a young couple raising two small girls, Linda 8 and Terry 4. They were expecting what they hoped would be a boy in December, but here I stand. But at the time, they'd been married about 11 years, and they were living the American dream, such as it was for African Americans in this country. You see, historically, Kansas held the promise of opportunity for African Americans. And my parents were part of that promise. They were homeowners, living in an integrated neighborhood. My father's employment with the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe came with union membership. They were secure. See, no one could have told them what was about to happen with a simple knock on the door. They'd also experienced the joy of business ownership. For a time, they owned a restaurant with another couple. But we were a typical 1950s family, you know, with the working father and a stay-at-home mother, church every Sunday. My father was like most African-American men of his era who had not pursued post-secondary education, but he wanted the best for his family. I want you to know Oliver Brown, the man. So as a young, newly married man, he worked for a mortician for a while. He went on to work as a bellhop at a whites-only hotel. He tried boxing, as you heard, in the Golden Gloves. And we laugh about the fact that once Dad experienced his first knockout in the Golden Gloves, he was called into the ministry. But obviously it was the appropriate and proper calling for him. Joe Louis had been his idol. He kind of looked a little bit like Joe Louis. For a time he drove a coal truck until finally he was hired as a shop welder for the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe Railroad. However, he, like his peers, was looking for a way out of society's margins and into the mainstream. So in 1950, he began the study for the ministry to become an African Methodist Episcopal pastor. But it was also 1950 when his childhood friend, Charles Scott, knocked on our door one Sunday afternoon and asked my father if he would join the NAACP's effort to file a legal action against the local school board in order to desegregate the elementary schools. Kansas was an interesting place, and I would imagine many of you have been there by a show of hands. All right. Generally, when I'm on the East or West Coast, I have to ask, did you stop? Because most people look at Kansas as someplace you drive through, but they assert they've been there. But Kansas was one of those places that was a crucible of contradiction. You see, it offered hope and promise immediately after the Civil War, actively recruiting African Americans to come live in Kansas. It was a place where you could own land. It was a place where you could be educated. It was a place where you could have employment. A lot of people, including my mother's parents, answered that call. See, my mother has a storied family history as well, in that her parents were sharecroppers. Wanting you to know this because I'm just one generation removed from sharecropping in this country. You know, we are what opportunity looks like, and hope is something everybody has the right to have. So Dad answered that door, and Charles Scott asked him if he would join. He thought a minute, and after a few weeks of contemplation decided his answer would be yes. My father was not a member of the NAACP, but he would attend meetings when called on to offer prayer. Now, one thing we have learned living in the midst of history is how misunderstood it can sometimes become. You know, people have come up with all sorts of reasons Oliver Brown ended up leading the roster of plaintiffs. You can go online, which I discourage, and read a lot about Brown v. Board. And let me assure you, it's a head scratcher. You know, my father was asserted to have sought out Thurgood Marshall for this case, and my father never met Thurgood Marshall. My father was asserted to have been a World War II veteran who came back, fired up, you know, and wanting to make a change, and my father never served in the military. You see, if you don't write your story, young people, somebody else will. So it's important to leave that legacy the way you would have it told, to leave that narrative in your voice. Well, his decision that summer of 1950 would change the lives of our family and the lives of countless others. In the span of 4 years, from 1950 to 1954, my father found himself testifying before the federal district court. He completed his studies for the ministry. He was ordained and was assigned to his first church in 1953, St. Mark A.M.E. Church in Topeka, Kansas. And by 1954, his name became etched on U.S. history. When on May 17, 1954, at 12:52 p.m., the United States Supreme Court, under the leadership of Chief Justice Earl Warren, announced its unanimous decision in Oliver L. Brown et al. Versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas et al. Now, as a teachable moment, I want you to know that ET period AL period means and others. Now, Brown v. Board of Education was a collective action. Now, democracy is messy, but it requires that when called on, we take a stand. That we stand up to right when we see things are wrong. You know, we have a responsibility as U.S. citizens. One of my favorite phrases is that being a United States citizen, it's not a spectator sport. It is something you have to be fully engaged in and take very seriously. The rights we enjoy are not guaranteed in perpetuity. We have to make sure we do our part to make certain they stay in place. Well, shortly after 1954, my father found himself appearing in his only televised interview, a CBS syndicated show called The 20th Century. After 6 years at St. Mark's A.M.E. Church in Topeka, where he helped increase membership and raise funds through community concerts, one of those concerts featured the Clara Ward Singers, and I know some of you in this audience know who they were. After 6 years there, in 1959, he was assigned to Benton Avenue A.M.E. Church. So we moved to Springfield, Missouri. Here, I believe, is where my father came into his own as a civil rights activist. Here is where he answered the call to the kind of community service he always aspired to. He was always a civic-minded person. He belonged to the Chamber of Commerce when there weren't many African Americans involved in that type of civic pursuit. He repeated his success at St. Mark here at Benton Avenue, helping to increase membership. My father, this ordinary man, this man of God, this man that insisted that we were in church every Sunday, this man that made sure we were at Sunday school and morning service and afternoon worship and choir rehearsal and usher bird and missionary meeting and youth activities and holiday pageants and summer vacation Bible school. It was quite a life, but I wouldn't trade it for the world. But what I learned from him and my mother is the necessity of collective action, the power of words. Watching my parents here in Springfield was an example of what commitment, duty, and leadership looks like. Because what it has required is that we be good stewards of that history. It has required that we use every moment as a teachable moment. It has required that we make certain that the message to this and future generations is one that their work could not have gone in vain. And that you're here now for the young people in the room. And when you hear, the dialogue about states' rights and who has the right to do this, that, or the other, it's your turn to add your voices, to do what's right, and to make certain that the hope inherent in Brown v. Board of Education remains something that everybody has a right to. Thank you.